The Knight's Tale, Parts 1 and 2, as told by Patty Kewell. Old stories tell us that Theseus conquered the land of Femine and married her queen Hippolyta. He returned to Athens in victory with the host of his troops and the queen's sister Emily. While there is much to be told regarding the chivalry of those battles, the limited amount of time the entire group has to participate in this supper challenge propels the story forward. As Theseus enters Athens, he finds all the women in mourning and asks them why they are negating his victorious return. Theseus asks what has caused the mourning and how it can be avenged. The matriarch explains the women do not intend to spoil his victorious return, but that all of them have lost their husbands during a battle in Thebes. She requests his pity and gentleness, explaining that all of the women are noble, also explaining the bodies of their husbands are being ravaged by hounds because they were not allowed proper burial or ceremony. The knight responds with compassion and vows to seek justice on Creon. Theseus sends Hippolyta and Emily on to Athens and charges immediately with his warriors to Thebes. Under the banner of honor and chivalry, he defeats and kills Creon in valiant knightly fashion. He restores the bones of the slain to their grieving wives, and only briefly mentions the ceremonial cremation of their remains before returning to the battle story. Following his victory, Theseus remained on the battlefield, and helping in the pillage of the defeated, he discovered the undead bodies of Arcite and Palamon. Recognizing they were clothed in royalty, he had them brought to his camp and delivered to a prison in Athens. The two prisoners were given no chance for freedom, and Theseus was heralded with great honor among his people. Meanwhile, springtime arose, and Emily presented herself as an available maiden. Radiantly dressed and groomed, she wandered the garden in search of flowers, singing beautifully along the way. From the neighboring prison tower, Palamon, in his despair and imprisonment, caught a glimpse of Emily in the garden. He cried out at her love-struck beauty, while Arcite misinterpreted that cry of self-pity, and then continues to chastise Palamon for not recognizing the handiwork of the gods, albeit not freedom, in having spared their lives. Palamon replies that it is not the vanity of hoping for freedom, but the pain of being love-struck that has caused his reaction. He then declares that Emily must be a goddess, and prays to Venus, who has allowed someone as pitiful as he to have seen such beauty, to show further compassion upon his household. Arcite then steals a glance at Emily, but is equally smitten, crying out with his own desire for her. In anger, Palamon demands to know if Arcite is mocking or betraying him as his brother-in-arms. Arcite replies he is earnest, to which Palamon reminds Arcite of their brotherly vows to never do the other harm, and that it would be a violation of their knight's code for Arcite to pursue the woman whom Palamon had already professed his love for. Arcite replies that it is Palamon who is in the wrong, asserting that Palamon thought that Emily was a goddess, and it was only out of holiness and reverence that he was in love. Arcite clearly knew that Emily was human, and for which he had carnal love. Arcite further proclaims that in matters of love, the rules of chivalry do not even apply, regardless of the circumstance. He then dismisses any possibility for either of them to have Emily anyway, and wallows in the despair of their hopeless imprisonment, justifying whatever action the other might take in survival. They argued at length, which again the knight doesn't have time to explain, until finally a friend of Theseus visits Athens. Prometheus and Theseus have loved each other similarly as brothers since childhood. Prometheus was also dear friends with Arcite and eventually convinces Theseus to release him. Theseus relents with a condition that if ever Arcite were to tread within his realm, Theseus would have him killed on the spot. Arcite cries out in misery that freedom without Emily is worse than imprisonment. He is envious of Palamon, who at least will be able to still see Emily from his prison, and likens his release to hell instead of the bliss, claiming that at least Palamon can still hold on to the hope of someday gaining Emily for himself. Arcite continues to wail at the error of men who praise for that which they don't understand, while wasting that which they have been given. Palamon, unaware of the conditions for Arcite's release, learns of his release and envisions the valor with which Arcite will return to conquer Theseus and take Emily for his wife. At this thought, Palamon welcomes death, certain he no longer has any reason to endure his confinement. He cries out in despair at the injustice of the gods. Palamon declares that even the animals get what they want without any regard, while good men like him are punished and kept from their desires. His despair goes on to declare that only preachers can explain the sufferings of man and the torment in which they must endure at the whims of the gods. He concludes with the realization that the lineage of Thebes is now dead. The narrator then summarizes that both endured many months of misery, Palamon in his confinement and Arcite in his banishment, neither to win the fair Emily. The narrator asks the audience which they think has it worst. Part 2. Arcite was allowing himself to wither away in misery and depression, despite his freedom, so much so that his very appearance was no longer recognizable. One night Arcite dreamt that the god Mercury appeared to him and said that Athens held an end to all your woe. Fearless of death, in the hopes of seeing Emily, Arcite determines to return to Athens. He determined that grief had so disfigured his appearance that he would be safe to return, since no one would recognize him. Therefore he rejected his knightly status and disguised himself in common clothing. He took his similarly disguised squire, who was the only person who really knew his secret, with him to the gates of Athens, where he availed himself for lowly work. He was strategic in taking a job within the household of Emily, and readily performed whatever tasks were asked of him. He quickly advanced on account of his work ethics and noble character, until finally the Duke Theseus himself promoted him to his squire. His gain, however, was deceitful, in that his own countrymen were secretly bringing him tribute that he was in turn secretly using to fund blissful living. Meanwhile, for 7 long years, Palamon endured his misery in prison, until, with the help of a friend and the destiny of fate, he escaped his cell in the middle of the night after drugging the jailer with opium-laced wine. Fearing daylight, Palamon slipped into a grove to await nightfall yet again. His plan was to return to Thebes, gather an army, return to defeat Theseus, and win the heart of his Emily. Following a glorious sunrise, Arcite rose to frolic in the springtime air. He happened upon the very same grove, unaware of Palamon, and decided to make himself a springtime garland from its growth. Driven by lust and singing along as he wandered, Arcite was seen, yet not recognized, by Palamon, who continued to hide in the bushes. Arcite sung of the manic depressive behavior that Venus infuses into the love-struck, crashing between highs and lows in the misery of love. He cried out for the justice of Thebes, and, unaware that Palamon was listening, wailed on about his disguise and the predicament of serving his enemy instead of enjoying the lineage of his royal family. He cursed the gods and revealed his true name while he was at it. He wallowed on and on about Palamon and the predicament of them both loving Emily, until he eventually passed out. Palamon leapt from the bushes with anger, declaring Arcite a traitor and revealing the trickery with which Arcite had behaved. Palamon challenged Arcite to a duel, declaring that he would have Emily and that God's grace had allowed him to have escaped prison. Arcite accepted the challenge, declaring his own justification to love Emily, and nobly offered to bring food and bedding for the night, along with weapons in the morning for their secret duel. Arcite rose early the next day and brought all the armor they both would need. As they prepared for their secret battle, the thrill of the hunt and survival began to rise in each of them. Without speaking a word to the other, they each helped the other into their armor and then jumped into battle. The two fought like madmen, until, as destiny would have it, Theseus happened along on a hunting party. In his bliss and love for hunting, he and a great company rushed into the very same grove where a hart was said to have been seen. To his surprise, he happened upon Palamon and Arcite, who were still fighting like hideous madmen. Theseus, seeing the desperation with which both were fighting, halted the battle and asked what sort of men they were to be fighting so valiantly, as if in a tournament, yet without a judge. As of yet, he did not recognize them. Palamon humbly declared that they were but wretches, worthy both to be slain. He asked the Lord to slay him first and then the other, and then proceeded to reveal Arcite's true identity and their mutual love for Emily. He then revealed his own identity, confessed his escape from prison, and professed again his love for Emily and desire to die with honor before her, so long as both he and Arcite were both to be killed. Theseus agreed that by their own confession they both deserved to die and would. However, the queen, along with all the women present, realizing the entire debate was out of a very deep love, begged her husband for mercy. Pity finally arose within Theseus, quenching his anger. Recognizing their guilt, yet further moved by the compassion of the women and the logic of love's folly, he chose to respond with mercy. Crying out to the gods and declaring it is they who have willed for Palamon and Arcite to be riddled with such misery, so much so that they would return to their own deaths in the pursuit of love, he mocked Emily, who was unaware of the trickery or pursuit, while recalling his own enslavement to love. Out of empathy and his love for his wife and sister, Theseus pardoned Palamon and Arcite with the condition that both of them would never wage war against him and would instead become his allies. Both agreed to this. Theseus then said that since they both were noble enough to wed Emily, yet she could marry not 2 men, that they must return in 50 weeks with 100 men each to properly battle for her hand in marriage. Theseus declared that he himself would judge the tournament. Both of the men joyfully agreed to this arrangement and raced home to Thebes.